So I would also like to pay my respects to the Drugal and to the Jagera people who I've worked with in the past, and acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging. As Vince said, I'm an archaeologist. I am technically based at the University of Notre Dame up in Broome, but I don't spend a lot of time there because I spend most of my time out in the field. And I am just one of a team of archaeologists who are working on this project. So having said that, there is a team of researchers who are working on this, but at a critical level, we've been working with Indigenous communities across Queensland. And this is just a sample of some of the communities we have been working with. So our research into the Native Mounted Police was really born out of our relationships as researchers working with communities. Some of our team, particularly Ian Davidson, has worked in Queensland since the 1970s, and I've worked there since 2001. And this project really came about because every Aboriginal community we have ever worked with as archaeologists, regardless of what project we were working on, when we would go and talk to the communities about the cultural heritage project we were just about to do, what would come out of it would be stories about frontier conflict and about the wars and the massacres and the killings that had happened. And these are a critical part of communities explaining to us who they were, how they were how they were on their country now, and this was what they thought was really important to share with us. Even if we were doing a project about something 40,000 years ago, they thought it was important to tell us about this much more recent history, to connect us with them and their stories and their country. And so over the course of decades of working with people, we came to the realisation that we needed to do a project on frontier conflict. And we've been talking about it, myself and Bryce Barker, when I was based at the University of Queensland. We talked about it then and sort of said, oh, maybe the time's right now, and it didn't quite get off the ground. And about 5 years later, we came together again and said, right, how about now? And what we talked about with doing with Aboriginal communities, we talked about mapping massacre sites. And we realised just how difficult that was going to be. It is literally like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is not like CSI. There are, despite all the massacres that have happened out there, despite all the killings, in archaeological terms, trying to find those sites is incredibly difficult. And we've published papers about why it's so difficult. And we also thought at that time that there was probably not a very strong political will to be having a federal government funding a project on massacre archaeology. So we thought, and yet despite this, communities kept saying, we need to do this, we need to talk about this. And the more we talked about it with them, the more we realised that we could do an archaeology of the Native Mounted Police, that historians had been writing amazing books, people like Ray and Frank and Jonathan and Ray Evans and Timothy Bottoms, had been writing a lot about the history of the Native Mounted Police, and what was lacking was any tangible evidence in terms of the landscape and the archaeology. So we thought we could do a project that grounded us in the landscape out there on country. And so that was how this project was born, the archaeology of the Native Mounted Police, because we realised we might not be able to find the massacre sites, but we could certainly go out and find the Native Mounted Police campsites. So just very quickly, I won't go too much into the history of the Native Mounted Police because I'm sure some of you already know that, and if you were here last year, you've heard some of that. But basically, the Native Mounted Police are a paramilitary force who operate from 1849 up until about 1904 when they finish. So they're pre-separation, and they are really the culmination of a British approach to administering its colonies. So the Native Mounted Police are not unique to Queensland, they're not unique to Australia, they were rolled out in every colony of the British diaspora. So we have the equivalent of the Native Mounted Police in India, in South Africa, in Canada. What we see with the Queensland Native Mounted Police is probably the culmination of these guys are the most experienced, most well-administered in some ways. It's sort of everything that has been learned in the previous 100 years sort of comes to the fore in how the Native Police operates in Queensland. So we're talking about a government agency that runs for about 50 years. Over the course of that 50 years, they operated out of, we think, about 196 different police camps spread all over Queensland. Some of those camps were only occupied for a few months, some of them were occupied for 20 years, depending on whether they were a headquarter or a sort of a patrol camp. There were at least 450 white officers who served in the Native Mountain Police, and we've identified at least 850 troopers, so Aboriginal men who served in the police during that time. At any one time, it's very hard to work out how many officers there were, how many camps were in operation at any one time. But we've been trying to do that through our project. And fundamentally, their job was to put down Aboriginal resistance to European incursions on traditional lands. So they are not a regular police force in any sense of the word. They are a paramilitary force. And we have documents where people in towns are complaining about the drunken rowdiness that's going on in town. And they say, can't we get the native police to come and sort this out? They're just down the road. But the native police were not involved in regular policing activities. So quite often they may have been working out of the same camps, but the Native Mountain Police had a very specific role, which was to deal with Aboriginal people and frontier conflict. So some of the things we've been investigating through our projects are the activities of the Native Mountain Police. So where were they based? When were they there? Where did they situate their camps? Why did they situate them there? And looking at that issue of resistance by Aboriginal people. Because the only reason this force was required was because Aboriginal people resisted European settlement. So we have to not think of Aboriginal people as being passive victims in this. Aboriginal people were making active choices about how they were going to try and deal with this new threat that had entered their landscape. We were interested in the living and working conditions of those camps, so we have a lot of documentary sources about the minutiae of some of the camps and what was going on with the finances and things, but we didn't really know a lot about what the living and working conditions were like. So, what was it like in a camp like that, and what were the domestic and hierarchical arrangements? So we've been investigating those through archaeological excavations. I think we've excavated 8 of the camps now. And you see very, very strong, as you might expect, strong hierarchical arrangements. So the officers were over here, the Aboriginal troopers were over there, and they didn't actually have much interaction at all in terms of what we can see. In terms of like their refuse, the officers had all the beautiful ceramics, they had lots and lots of alcohol, they had very nice china, very nice lead decanters, all sorts of things of better cuts of meat. The Aboriginal troopers had no ceramics, almost no glass. They looked like they were surviving mostly on native fauna. So even though they were supposedly getting rations, the rations they were getting were not enough to keep them alive and things. So those are the sorts of things we've been investigating through the archaeology. And another critical part of our project is obviously because we've been working with Aboriginal people for decades, in some cases for some of our team members, capturing some of those oral histories. And it is a little odd for me to be here in Reconciliation Week as here's another white historian or white archaeologist telling Indigenous stories. But our Aboriginal colleagues have been front and centre of this project. We never do any fieldwork without them being involved, and a key part of our database, which I'm going to show you and talk to you about, is having their voices captured. So we've been doing interviews with people which will be in our database, which will be available to you guys as teachers and educators and students, so you can hear in Aboriginal people's voices some of the stories about the massacres and the stuff that was handed down. And I'm going to play you one of those audio files a little bit later. So these are just some of the other things that we've been trying to do is to look at those relationships between the police and local Aboriginal people and how that worked, as well as their relationships with the pastoralists or the miners who were out there, looking at how that police system changed and why it changed through time and space, and comparing and contrasting these different forms of heritage, so the material culture, people's living memories, to better understand frontier conflict. And I guess that is a part of, as has been said, trying to grapple with what is practical reconciliation and how can we move forward. And the thing that's come out with, for the years that we've been working with all of these Aboriginal communities, is people want to talk about what happened. They want to acknowledge it. And if we can help those communities do that by developing these resources and this database, then we think that that's been a good way for the government to spend their research funds. So as I say, you know, we're archaeologists, we go out and we dig holes in the ground, so some of you have seen some of these images. These are some of the native mounted police camps spread across Queensland. These are ones that we have physically been to and physically ground truth we've actually located. Here is the exact location where the camp was. We're about to, in 3 or 4 weeks' time, about to go and do another 8 weeks of field work. So we suspect we'll probably have another 15 or so camps to add to that at the end of that time. We're not going to be excavating anymore, but we're certainly going to be documenting more of those sites. When we do go out to sites, even when you don't excavate, you will typically find lots and lots of artefacts, and these are the classic artefacts that you find that let you know that you're on a native mounted police camp rather than just a pastoral camp. The buttons, which are really distinctive buttons with the Victoria Regina insignias on them, and then cartridges and bullets. Huge numbers of cartridges in particular on some of these sites. So, and they're pretty powerful moving objects. When you have a Snider bullet that you pick up off a site, you get a sense of, oh my goodness, that would have done a lot of damage to a human body. So it can be pretty confronting out there looking at this kind of material. Some of you will know we have a blog site where we try, I have to admit I haven't posted anything for about the last 6 weeks, I've been a bit too busy, but we do try and post really regularly just on different aspects of what we've been doing. So some of that is history, some of it is archaeology. Sometimes we have guest bloggers, so Frank has written some guest posts for us on his great-grandfather? Great-uncle?
My great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, yes. So it's worth going and having a look at that as well if you're looking for material to share with students and to give people some background on some of these issues. But one of the critical things that we've been doing, which I really want to introduce you to and run you through today, and some of you have now got logins to, is the database that we've been building. So one of the things when we came to this project, we realised it's incredibly difficult to get your hands on the primary source material. If you want that material, you have to go to the archives. Most of the Queensland archives are not digitised and they're not available online. And so we found that really problematic because we're based everywhere except Brisbane, strangely. So, you know, every time we want to, it's a special trip to come to the archives. So we thought, instead of us going and just using all that material, how about if we actually digitised it as we went and transcribed it as we went and made it available? So that's what we've done. We've taken a whole lot of material and put it into a digital format. We wanted to also make all the archaeological material that we've been excavating and finding available as well. So this is one of the really big problems with archaeology, is that you go out and you do a dig and then the stuff goes into a museum collection and it's never seen again. So what we've been doing is actually cataloguing all of the artefacts we've been excavating them, photographing them, measuring them, describing them, and then putting them into the database so students, researchers, anyone can go and have a look, and you can look up and see what a Snider bullet looked like and where it came from, etc., etc. So all of that material is in there. We wanted to make really clear how complex this issue and this material is to deal with, and I know that's something that it's really hard to grapple with, particularly for students. Students often want to have, you know, like, what's the answer here? What do I have to learn? What do I have to know? And history is about learning. As I say, it's not about what's right or wrong, and your opinion is worth nothing. What is worth something is what you can argue, and how do you argue that case? So you can argue, you can look at exactly the same source material and interpret it completely differently. And I guess this is some of where the culture wars and the history wars come into this, because we're all effectively working off the same material and people choose to interpret it in different ways. And if you don't share the complexities and the difficulties in interpreting that, if you say, well, this is my view and here's the evidence from my view and this is all there is, it's very easy for the troll of people who don't want to acknowledge what happened to say, well, you're wrong, I'm not going to listen to any of that. You don't know what you're talking about. What we wanted to do was to say, well, you read the 10,000 documents that we've read, and then you come back and then you tell us what argument you're going to make on the basis of those 10,000 documents. And I literally mean 10,000 documents. And as we said, we wanted to bring some of the voices of our Indigenous colleagues into this space. So one of the things, I guess you guys probably know, I'm preaching to the converted, but if you want to bring Indigenous people into your classrooms, that means you're drawing on the local Aboriginal community in your local area. And that community is going to be dealing with a whole lot of other issues. And they are constantly going to have people saying, please come and talk to us, come and do this. And it gets very, very, very wearing and very tiring for Aboriginal people. And so we thought one of the things we could do is actually capture some oral histories and put them into the database, so you don't necessarily need to, you should absolutely of course engage with the local Aboriginal community where your school is, but if they're not available, you can actually draw some resources from here and say, well, let's hear from Vince, who's a Bungawarra man from up in Cape York, and we can hear his story without him needing to be there. So this is just a little infographic. Some of you might have seen this on our blog site from, I think, in December. I have updated it again. So this is sort of our database in a nutshell, which you will have access to. So at the moment, we've got 1,508 events of frontier conflict mapped in our database. So those are attacks on Aboriginal people, as well as attacks on European people, as well as attacks on stock, as well as attacks on property. We have thousands of catalogued artefacts in different categories within the database, which you can see. And we have, at the moment, and this has probably gone up again since the other day, but more than 10,000 primary sources in there for you to see, 1,200 images, 341 other secondary resources. So these are things like journal articles or books that are available, papers that people have written, a whole series of maps and other things that are in there. So if you've already gone and got your login, you'll know that that's the landing page that you go to at this URL. Once you've logged in, you land on this page. So I thought what I'll do is go through the database. If you've had a chance, some of you will know this, but it can be very frustrating, and we are struggling all the time with our IT database guys to say, this just isn't intuitive to us. You need to fix it. So we thought we'll open it up to you guys. You can go and have a play, see what works, see what doesn't work. You've probably, if you've tried to do that, you've probably gone, this doesn't work, why can't I see, why is my map empty? The map will be empty because there's a little trick you need to know about it. So I thought I'll go through that with you. Once I've given you that briefing, then you can sit there with your computers, you can have a look, you can play, we can go through things, and you can start to get a sense of what's in that database and how you may be able to how you might envisage using it in your classrooms, so that over the next 6 months, as we sort of fine-tune it and get it to the point where we're going to publicly launch it, we can then take on board all of your advice and your suggestions and build that in so that it is more user-friendly, so that when it is there for you guys to use all the time, it is actually going to be something that you can use. So this is a critical part of it, the menu at the top. Some of these things, the reports section, you don't really need to worry about that bit. Collections, don't worry about that bit. I've tried to get the database guys to take those things off there and they can't, so don't worry about them. There's a few things you need to know with the database. There are different views within the database. So this is what is called the default view. So in a default view, you will see a map, you will see content, and you'll see a menu down the side. But there are two other types of views. There is a map view, where you only see the map. Then there is also a content view, where you only see the content. So sometimes there may not be maps associated with parts of the database, so you can't see a map view. Other times, the map view is really critical, and that's what you'll be wanting to look at. So I tend to work in this bit of it and look at this bit of it, and then if I want to look at the map, I specifically put the map view up there. So if you're not seeing the stuff you want to see, check that little box up the top that you're in the right view. The other thing is, when you are in a map view, there are different layers. So if you're used to working at all with GIS or anything, or even Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator, where you sense that you've got layers that you can switch on and off, we have layers within our maps. And the layers are controlled by this little button up in the top. So you need to click on that. So this, you can see, here's all these dots, and these are actually all of the events that we've got mapped. So attacks on Aboriginal people, attacks on Europeans, attacks on stock, and attack on property. If you click that button, you'll see here's some different layers within it. You can see I've got those different layers turned on in that view. The other thing you can do is change this base layer map. So at the moment, this is your sort of standard Google satellite imagery. We can actually change that to Google Terrain. So that, depending on whether you're seeing, if things aren't looking really easy, it's very hard to get colours for things that work on both maps and that show the relationships in the way that we wanted to. So sometimes it can be useful just to know to flick between those different views and things. So I thought I'd go through the different key sections of the database, and then we'll see where we go from there. So we've got about 203 camps identified. It's very complicated. Sometimes they talk about just working in a district, other times they talk about a specific camp. So there's the Wide Bay camp or the Wide Bay district, which may have had 3 or 4 camps in them. That's why the numbers are a little bit rubbery. At that stage, we'd had 41 camps visited. It's a little bit more than that now, and 8 that we've excavated. And this, as of 3 days ago, this is how many artefacts are in there. So, 4,000 glass artefacts, 305 buttons, all of these sorts of things are in there. So when you click on that tab at the top right that says archaeology, this is the landing page that you will end up on. And you can click into every one of these things, but probably the main one you want is the NMP camps. So that's where all the information that we have about these different camps is held. So if you click into that, this is what you will see. Now, if you've got your map view turned on and you've got the right layers clicked, you will actually see where all those Native Mounted Police camps are. So as I say, some of these we've ground truthed, so they're absolute real locations in space. Other times it'll be something like, there was a police camp at Banana. Okay, where's the town of Banana? And we're putting a dot on a map. And if any of you are familiar with Lynley Wallis' massacre map, she's done very much that approach. Those massacre sites have not been ground truthed. She has put those dots on the map, sitting in the archives and in the library and going, this massacre happened on this river, here's Google Earth, here is this river, I'm going to put a dot on the map here. So we've got both sets. We've got things that we have ground truthed and things that we haven't. And usually it will tell you, once you drill down into it, whether this is a site that we've visited or not. When you get in there, you'll see every one of these entries is clickable, and you can then drill down to get into all of the information about that specific camp. You can also click on any one of these dots, and if you click on one of these dots, it will tell you which camp it is, and then there's a hyperlink there, and you can click on it and it will take you to the record for that particular camp. So if you do drill down into it, the next view you'll get will be, you've drilled down, your map automatically goes to where that camp was, and then you start to see all of the information that we have about it. That menu on the left-hand side tells you that there is one individual who we've got associated with this particular camp, and we've got 12 documents about it. There are 2 events that relate to officers coming out from this camp and going out and killing Aboriginal people or responding to an attack on stock, and that we've got 3 postings. So we know of 3 individuals, either troopers or officers, who were stationed at that camp. As you scroll down, you'll see here are the events, so those 2 events that we've mentioned. You can click then into those as well, and they will take you to all of the information that we have about those events. Similarly, here are the postings, so these are the 3. 2 of these are actually white officers, William Cave and Alfred Patrick, who were stationed at this particular camp, and Waverley, who was also stationed at that camp. As you can imagine, it's really quite difficult trying to work out who was stationed at the camp at any one time, because the records are just so incomplete. But as we say, these bits of the database are all, again, active links. So as well, in this archaeology homepage, if we go back to it, you can click on any of these objects. So these are the artefacts we've excavated. If you click into weapons and ammunition, because that's kind of the obvious, iconic kind of thing, you then get images and records of all of the bullets, cartridges that we've excavated. You can then search them, so if you wanted to find a particular year or a particular camp or a particular type of ordnance, you can search for it, and at any time you can almost always there'll be a little search button over there. So as you can see, these are all the different things you can search within. And of course, each one of these entries is active and a link, and when you click into it, here's all the information that you get about all of those artefacts that we've catalogued from all of the sites we've been working on. There's a people section of the database, so this is that second tab. When you click into that, you'll see officers, troopers, associated individuals and researchers. So when we talk about the officers of the Native Mounted Police, we are talking about typically the white officers of the force. Sometimes these are officers who are very, very high. So the Commissioner of Police is listed in our database as an officer, even though he was never actually out in these camps. But he was whom officers would report up the line to. So the Commissioner of Police, actually, his name appears on huge numbers of documents. He was the one giving approvals for officer transfers, officer promotions, the expenditure of funds, etc., etc. The troopers, so these are the Aboriginal men who made up the bulk of the force. Now, the troopers have been a really difficult category for us to document, primarily because they rarely appear in the written sources. So these are, like as with any historical source, you know, the women, the children, the disenfranchised, the poor, migrants very rarely appear in the written sources, and it's very much the case with Aboriginal people in the written sources about the Native Mounted Police. So one of the things it's very hard because they were often given European names when they joined, and if they moved camps, they could just be given a different European name. So they didn't even get to keep their names when they moved camps. They might turn up and you might have two Jacks in the one camp, so one became Jack 1 and one became Jack 2, and then Jack 2 moved somewhere else, so then they called him Johnny. So it's incredibly difficult as trying to work with this material and try to work out who was where when and who they were serving under. Some of these men, the only thing we know about them is we have one mention of one name and one camp at one time. That's it. That's the only thing we've ever been able to find out about them. There are a few individuals as troopers who we do know quite a lot about, and one of those in particular is Jack Noble. And Jack Noble has descendants who are alive today and they've been involved in our project, and we have interviews with Jack Noble's descendants, and we're hoping they will give us permission to put those interviews into the database to be made public as well. So we suspect that a lot of Aboriginal people who we work with will be interested in looking at the database to try and find their ancestors in there, and that's why we put it all in there, but we realise it's very hard. If you know your great-grandfather was called Sandy and he was a trooper, well, there's actually 20 Sandys in the database, so it would be very hard for them to figure that out, but at least the information is now there for people to be able to go and look through. Associated individuals are anybody else who has been mentioned in a report or a letter or a newspaper account. They might have been the pastoralist, they might have been the police magistrate, they might have been a landowner, they might have been a politician. They have turned up in some of our sources, and so we've given them an entry. And one of the things that comes out of doing our research is you realise just how small the Queensland European community was through that 19th century. The same people's names keep popping up time and time and time again. And a very large number of the politicians who were making the laws, passing the legislation, making the decisions, running the inquiries, were actually the landowners they owned the stations where the Native Mounted Police were patrolling. So it's a very, very complex social web that's going on. So that was why we thought it was quite important and useful to put these individuals in there. And a lot of these are really big names of people in Queensland's colonial history. Researchers are just people like myself, so we have entries in there so you can see who recorded what site, who recorded which artefact, etc. So if we go back and look at what a typical entry for an officer might look like when you click in, this is the kind of thing you'll say. So we've got 5 pages of officers. We're showing the first 50 of 445 entries, and here they're alphabetised. So you can see you can just click on a link here and change them from A to Z, to Z to A. You can also change from who was most recently added or who, etc. So there are different ways you can do that. Again, on the left, you can filter that. So you can search. So if you had a relative who was in the Native Police, you could search for their name and it will pop you up straight away. So, as I said, yep, you can order that. So all of these are clickable. When you click in, it then sends you into their entry. And if we search for, say, Coward, there was an officer called Tom Coward, we can then bring up Tom Coward's record. Now with the map again, if you show the key for the map, if you put the postings that are related, if you click that layer on, you'll see these were actually all of the places, all of the camps where Tom Coward was posted during his career in the Native Manor Police Force. As you scroll down, again, default view, make sure you're in the right view and make sure you've got the right layer on. Again, here's all the related documents that are in there. So 131 documents mention Tom Coward by name. And as you can see, events, he was involved in 9 events of frontier conflict. Now that might have been an attack on stock where he was then sent out there to respond. It might have been an attack on Aboriginal people where he may have been involved. So you really need to drill down into that to find out what those events are all about. So as you scroll down, you start to see we've tried to capture sort of biographical information about people as well. And again, that's really hard, and we could probably do with another 100 researchers who are researching each of these individuals. So again, some people we know a lot about, some we don't, but we put in birth date, death dates, who they were married to, how many children they had, etc. You can start to see a posting, so where these guys were posted at what times, and you can see there's a lot of overlap in the postings, and that's because some of these guys were moving around. They might have written a letter from one Native Mountain police camp, even though they were actually stationed at another camp. They may have been out on a patrol, they may have called in, they may have written a letter from there. So we have an indication they were at that camp at that particular date, so there's an entry for that, but they were actually posted somewhere else permanently. So there's a lot of mess in here that we've tried to disentangle and tried to, it's good for people and students and people to understand how complex it is, but we were also trying to make sense of it in some sort of way. If you scroll down, you'll see documents, and I'll talk about these more later, so that's the postings. Again, every one of these is a hyperlink, so you can click on whichever camp he was posted at and you will end up with a camp entry. You can see that camp operated from this time to that time, here's all the documents about it, etc. The documents themselves, every one of these is a hyperlink, so you click on it, and here you will see the transcribed entry for it, and if you click down here, you will also be able to directly get the article out of, so you don't even have to go to Trove yourself, all of it is embedded in the database, so you can see it there. So everything we've got from the archives, we have photographed, turned into a PDF and then transcribed it for you. So my mother, Heather's mother, our relatives, they sit there at night and they transcribe old copper plate writing for us. So we don't guarantee the quality of all the transcriptions, and there's huge amounts of star hash, I can't read this, the page is torn, the page is dirty, but you can actually see, you will see the PDF of that original document in there for everything that we have in there. The events section of the database, this is probably where I know a lot of you are going to be interested and which is really valuable in terms of teaching and learning. So when you go into the events, there are actually a few more than that. There's a few things glitching behind the scenes where we haven't clicked the right box, but there are just over 1,500 events in there now. As you can see, there's different categories of attacks. One of the things you need to realise with these attacks is it suggests there are only 322 attacks on Aboriginal people, but there were 785 attacks on Europeans. Now, that is not to suggest that Europeans were by far the biggest victims of the frontier wars. This is simply a product of the fact that every time a European was speared or was killed or was threatened, it made the newspapers or somebody wrote about it. So that is why there are twice as many attacks on Europeans as there are attacks on Aboriginal people. So this is something that we think is really critical for people to understand when you're sharing this information with your students. Get students to think about, well, why is that the case? How come we know so much more about this? And then this actually ties back to the Mile Creek Massacre of 1838 and the trials that were held after that massacre in New South Wales. Because after that massacre, Europeans were hung for killing Aboriginal people. So it became, the lesson that came out of that was, you're going to kill Aboriginal people, you don't talk about it, you don't write about it, you don't share about it, you don't tell people about it, because the repercussions could be that you also could kill me for breaking the law. So we don't see huge amounts of information in the historical documents about many of these killings of Aboriginal people. So just be aware of that. So, as we said, there's 4 different types of events, and you can go in and click on all of these. If we look at attacks on Aboriginal people, click in, you'll see there's 318 of them. Again, exactly the same sort of format. Every one of these is an active hyperlink. You can click in this particular attack, 1889. If you then click into it, you'll see the information that we've been able to put together about it. We've tried to describe, we've tried to take those sources and say, well, these are the different versions of it. Sometimes they are merely the same event repeated in multiple newspapers, which often happen. One newspaper would publish it, the other regional newspapers would pick it up and republish it. We've put all those in there. We've linked them to individuals who are associated with them, so you can click and see who those individuals were, whether they were other associated individuals, whether they were troopers or officers. You can see all the documents, so you can click on and read the documents yourself about that event and determine whether they were contradictory, whether they are a seamless account of what happened, etc. The media section of the database relates to those documents, so you can see we've got images in there, we have documents in there. We have, at the moment, only 2 short audios. One of those I'm going to play for you in a minute. So you can see, but that will become more and more over the next 6 months. We're just waiting to get some final permissions, and we're editing. Many of our interviews are actually 1 or 2 hours long, and we don't think that's going to be effective for use in the classroom. So what we're actually doing is editing the long interviews down to 5 or 10 minute small segments that we think are quite tight and neat. So I'll show you one of those in a minute. So again, all of these are probably the 3 that you'd be most interested in: the images, the documents, the maps, and the references, and then the audio files. So if you click on the audio files, some of them will be interviews that we've done. Radio National is actually doing 2 stories that will be put out on History Listens on the 2nd and 9th of July with Radio National journalist Georgia Mooney. So when that comes, I can email you all and let you know that, and they'll be put into the database and on our blog as well. But you can see here, we've got an interview with Vince Harrigan, which we just did last month. Vince is one of the Balboa men who we've been working with up in Cape York for the last 5 years. And when you go in there, you can see a bit of information about that, and what attacks and what events and what Native Mounted police camps it relates to. So all of these, again, active links, you can flick between them. So I actually thought I would actually play you Vince's interview. It is 10 minutes, and I know it's probably not the best teaching method to stand up here and say, let me play you this video. But this is Vince's story, this is his family history, and it's actually, I find it incredibly emotional listening to it, and Vince has some things to say. So this is the kind of interview that we are putting into the database and making available for people to use. So I'll just hit play and let Vince tell you his story in his own words.
Vince Harrigan. I'm a traditional owner for one of the people at Lombi in Metal Camp. I grew up between here and out there, mainly in town here, Cooktown, to do my schooling and everything here. I always had that connection going back and forth out to Normanby. Also, my grandmother, she's from there at Wujal area, Gugayalanji, so yeah, I'm both, yeah. Remember my grandfather, he passed away when I was only about 12 years old, but I can still remember him, mentioning about how the troopers, used to come in, coming with a bit of force and wanted to pretty much get rid of them all, and my dad always spoke about how, they played a big part, not only in our area with the European side, up at places like Bora as well, Rogan and all that places. Yeah.
On your country, there's a native police camp, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I think it's only there for a couple of years. Not that long, but yeah, that was one day, yeah. Yeah, well, we still refer today as the old police camp. Yeah, it was an area of, pretty much a real sad place for us, because even when going back with the archaeologists, do some exploration stuff, always still felt a bit sad going back there, because I can still picture a lot of the old people, getting shot at there and, taken there and, hunted down like animals and taken there and being shot,
At school, did you hear much about the frontier conflict?
No, not once. No, never heard nothing. You know, the only time we heard it was when we were out bush, and especially back out in country, and you come into town here, and yeah, no one spoke about it. You know, they didn't tell you nothing.
Yesterday you just got back from the station you were, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I work out there, live and work out there. It's a fairly big property. It's a 31,400 hectare property in white man law, but we go further than that with the rivers and everything.
The Puckley's police camp, is that on your property?
Yeah.
Normanby?
Yeah, we're divided by the Normanby River, so we're on one side and Melsonby's on the other side of the river. Parkley's on the Normanby side that runs into the Normanby.
How do you get to the Puckley police camp?
Oh, you can only drive so far, and then you can walk in, about an hour walking. Yeah, it's very, you might as well say that frontier sort of country, you know. But it was it used to be an old track there with the old miners and that used to walk through as well, so you can see which sort of route they took, you know, between these two hills, like a big saddle in the hill. Yeah, no, it's a good days, you know, in and out sort of.
What stories did you hear in your family about the Aboriginal troopers in the Native Police?
They always said they had one, put in terms, they always had a black fellow with them to go out and stores handed down. Father and uncles and that. And he sort of had a bit of an idea where everyone was, you know. But they always said that they always had a black fellow with them. Yeah, my grandfather always said, yeah, you know, a few times there where they seen him, he'd see him before the troopers and that, the black fellow black tracker, he'd see him before the other troopers, and he'd actually let some of them off, let them go. Not all the time, but yeah, that's the sort of stuff they told us. Yeah, you have to be very lucky, I suppose. That was what he felt on the day, I suppose.
What's the reputation of the Native Police up here in Queensland?
What I've heard, I think they were up here to get rid of all the black ones, I think. Yeah. Especially with the gold mine at the farm and that, you know.